Our quantitative exercise tells us that the countries that will lose from TTIP are those that before TTIP enjoy preferential access to the EU markets. Preferential access means that those countries do not pay import tariffs. And this is true, for example, for countries in Northern Africa or in the Middle East. For those countries, the preferential access to the EU loses value. Why is that? That is because in the EU, competition from firms that are based in the United States becomes stiffer, so that the North African or Middle East companies will lose market share in Europe, and that on the macroeconomic level means that their countries will lose from TTIP. Older models that focused on tariffs exclusively could actually generate that outcome, namely that some countries form a trade agreement, but the world as a whole loses. But in the present context of TTIP, we are not really talking much about tariffs. We're talking about common regulation, about common standards, and these things would reduce the resource use in the EU and in the US. You do not need so many lawyers anymore or qualified workers who would make products conform to regulation or standards in the specific markets. That means we save resources, and these resource-saving elements of trade liberalization in TTIP mean that even for the world as a whole, there will be income gains. They are, as we've seen before, unevenly distributed. So it is the insiders who would win and the outsiders who would lose. But the world as a whole would win as well. Everything depends really on what the EU and the US negotiate. And it's in their hands how good or bad TTIP will be for third countries. Let me illustrate this with just two examples. The first one is about standards and regulation. We have seen that the TTIP agreement will be mostly about standards and norms. And the question is, how open will the agreement be to third countries? Imagine a firm from, let's say, China, and if this firm from China satisfies product standards that the EU and the US have agreed upon, will those goods produced in China be accepted to the EU and US markets or not? The question is, will those countries undergo additional testing and certification or not? The EU and the US can agree that products from China, if they meet the common standards, can access the market without further restrictions, and that would, in a sense, reduce the costs for third countries quite a bit. A second example to illustrate the point is about what we call rules of origin. Now, why are those required? They are required in all free trade agreements, and they set the conditions under which a good, let's say from Germany, can actually be freed from tariffs when it is exported to the US. And the condition under which this can happen usually is that the product is a German product. And that is defined in terms of value added. So there are minimum value added requirements that make a product from Germany eligible to being freed from tariffs when it's exported to the United States. Now, if German firms use inputs from suppliers in third countries, this can mean that the product can no longer qualify as a European product and therefore be freed from tariffs. The question is, what is this minimum value added requirement that the US want to see? And if that requirement is set very low, that means that suppliers from third countries will actually also benefit from tariff-free trade between the EU and the US. If the requirement is very high, that means that the discrimination between firms within the EU and others outside will be big, and that means that third countries will be losing more.